Our next question comes from Jennifer out of Bluffton, Tennessee, and she writes, I am currently studying the book of Daniel, and I have some questions related to prophecy and current events that are transpiring, specifically as it pertains to the 12th chapter of Daniel. If you have anything that you could share with me, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, let me just initially comment on the 12th chapter of the book of Daniel. I'm flipping over there now. And by the way, this person, where do they write from?
Tennessee, Pastor Carl.
Yeah, Tennessee. So she might not be aware of the fact that Search the Scriptures has an app and a website where there's hundreds and hundreds, it's in the thousands of messages. And I have preached through the book of Daniel, chapter by chapter and verse by verse, and gone through the entire book. And so I covered chapter 12 in detail, and it's prophetically significant. In fact, we were studying it this past Wednesday night, and we'll look at it again this coming Wednesday. In the chapter opens now at that time, Michael, the great prince, he's dealing with Michael the archangel, one of those super angels of sorts that God has ranked. Angels are organized in different ranks, and Michael is the archangel. I know we sing archangels in glory in one great hymn, but there's actually only one archangel that is mentioned. That doesn't mean there couldn't be others, but there's only one mentioned, and it's Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there'll be a time of distress such as has never occurred since there was a nation until that time. Now, that may have a very familiar ring to it, and if it does in your thinking, it's because Jesus references this very truth in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew chapter 24. And of course, at what time? Well, at the time described at the end of chapter 11. And so remember, the chapter and verse divisions are artificial. And so in the second half of chapter 11, he's describing this coming one world leader. We call him maybe most popularly Antichrist, though that name is only used by the Apostle John. There are, in fact, over 30 titles given for this coming world leader. And so he's described the most vivid description of the Antichrist in all the Bible is actually described in the 11th chapter of Daniel. And he describes this king, for instance, in verse 36, who will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will speak monstrous things. You can get further commentary on that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. It's what's referred to as the abomination of desolation. And so Jesus reminds us in Matthew 24, verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. And he gives a warning to those Jews who at this point had come to faith, and he tells them to flee. And of course, the Revelation tells us that God is going to supernaturally protect them because Satan is going to want to destroy them. And of course, when this mid-7-year event takes place, Jesus said, then there will be a great tribulation such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will, and unless those days had been cut short, no person would be saved. Sounds very familiar. Why? Because he's referencing Daniel the prophet. There will be a time of distress. Now I'm reading Daniel, such as has never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And then he says, at that time, your people, everyone who's found written in the book, will be rescued. So he talks about this rescue mission of God. It's called the second coming, when Jesus literally, physically, bodily returns to the earth. And he goes on from there. Now, I have, quite a bit of preaching on the book of Daniel, so I'm not going to preach those sermons here on the air, but that's the start for you. So Daniel 12 is very significant. Again, go to searchthescriptures.org, type in the search bar, Daniel, and you will find all those messages. You can click on chapter 12. Your second question comes concerning the book of Enoch. And the book of Enoch is what we would call an intertestament book. In other words, from the last author of the Old Testament. At least in our English Bible, it's Malachi. But Malachi comes at the end of the time when God had prophets in Israel. And between Malachi and Matthew, there's 400 years of silence where there's no prophet in Israel. And of course, between that 400-year spread, there are some books that are written that record Jewish history. They're not canonical. That is, they don't have the marks of canonicity. And so in my course on bibliology, again, available at searchthescripture.org, one of the sections that we deal with is how do we know, which books should go? Did the church determine it? Man does not determine what's inspired. Man just recognizes what God has inspired. And so how did they recognize, say, that the book of Jude was inspired, but the book of Enoch was not inspired? That Daniel was inspired, but 1st and 2nd Maccabees was not inspired? Well, there's certain tests of canonicity. And so Enoch falls in that 400-year period, and he writes some interesting thing, but he's not inspired. Now, some people would say, well, then why does Jude quote him? And they reference, and this is where I've turned to, the letter of Jude. It was about these men that Enoch in the 7th generation from Adam prophesied, saying, behold, the Lord came with many thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their ungodly deeds which they have done in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have against them. And so they would say, well, here it is. Jude is quoting directly, so Jude must mean that it is inspired. Listen, just because there is a reference to the book of Enoch doesn't mean that he's affirming that every word in the book of Enoch was inspired. And so understand that no one in the Jewish realm ever believed it was part of the canon of Scripture, and no one in the Christian realm ever believed it was part of Scripture. And many, myself included, doesn't believe he's even quoting the book of Enoch, that he is quoting a prophet of God by the name of Enoch who spoke prophetically. And that particular speaking made it into the book of Jude. And interestingly, there's a whole book supposedly written by this prophet that was not written by this prophet. It's part of what we would call the pseudepigrapha, graphe writings, pseudo-false, the false writings. It's not inspired by God. And sometimes people use these intertestament books as canonical, as inspired. But Jesus and the apostles never once, not once, quote any of the Old Testament never quote any of the intertestament books. They quote either directly or in a broad, wide range every single book of the Old Testament, but they never directly quote any of the intertestament books. And again, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, I think what took place was there was a man by the name of Enoch, and through oral tradition, people say, hey, remember Enoch? He's the one who lived from the 7th generation of Adam, and he prophesied that the Lord came with many thousands of his holy ones. And it's a prophetic future. You write it as if it had already happened. And so sometimes you call it a prophetic past tense. And so they'd said, you remember him? And yeah, and well, was that inspired? Well, you don't know until Jude includes it in the canon of Scripture. And so that particular saying that's found in the book of Enoch, that was said by a prophet of God who lived centuries before the book of Enoch was ever written, God the Spirit put his stamp of approval on it. So which came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, chicken came first, and Enoch lived from the 7th generation of Adam. The book of Enoch was written during the intertestament period. Some date it as late as 100 AD, but I think it falls within that intertestament period. But in either case, it's not inspired, and so it's not something you should give your heart to or study. Anyway, I hope that's helpful.
Dr. Carl Broggi answers your questions about the Bible and living the Christian life Tuesday mornings at 11 on The Light 88.7 FM and online around the world at wagp.net.